Welcome to First in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I am your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, freshly back to Central California after crossing the country twice to North Carolina and South Carolina, and glad to be home.
And with us today, we've got special guest Bethany Kazmarek, author extraordinaire, editor extraordinaire, sitting in with us today to talk about craft books. So, Bethany, why don't you give yourself a bit of an introduction? You've been with us before, but what have you been up to lately?
Well, I have been having some luck in. I got a possible offer for an agent, and I'm excited about that. So I'm writing furiously and trying to connect with. I write contemporary fiction for 20 to 30 somethings. So I'm enjoying that. That's just kind of rejuvenated everything. But I'm still very busy with the freelance editing.
Yes, absolutely. Writing like your hair's on fire, I'm sure.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. And for those not in the know, when she says 20 or 30 somethings, she's not talking about what she gets paid. She's talking about an age group.
Correct.
So.
I write for the 20 or 30 something, usually pennies is the 20s or 30 somethings that I get from my books. So, but yes, the audience there, absolutely. So, yes, as Pop said, we just got back from Blue Ridge. I was there, Bethany was there, and it was awesome to meet you again for the second time. And this time we had more of a working relationship, so we got to hang out infrequently, not as much as we'd hoped, but we did get a chance to sit down and chat some. And of course, Pops, you were running around like your hair was on fire trying to get everything situated for the conference. I thought it went very, very smoothly. As Bethany said, she's got an agent interested in her writing. A lot of really good connections happened. I brought some friends of mine from California. Molly Jo, who watches our cast every week, was there, had some fantastic luck. So it's really just a good opportunity to go recharge your batteries as a writer, interact with other writers, and also to lose a lot of sleep as you're hanging out talking with friends. And it can be kind of stressful and overwhelming at times, but I think the average conference goer is always pleased. They always go home, and after some time decompressing, they always realize, this was a really fantastic experience. So thank you, Pops, for putting that together with Edie Melson, who's watching tonight. Shout out to Edie, who's watching our podcast tonight. So a lot of fun with that.
Edie's both the brains and the beauty of the operation. I'm just a figurehead, and if things go well, I'll remain a figurehead. So.
So what you are? You're the Mercedes logo on the hood. That's what you are.
That's it. I'm the emblem. Yeah.
She's the engine. Okay. So fantastic, excellent. Well, that's what we're doing, and we'll just go ahead and jump into our topic today. Before we do, we always have our publishing term of the week, and this week we've got first right of refusal. First right of refusal.
Yes, it has a little bit to do with contracts. First right of refusal may or may not be in your contract. If you sign a contract with a publisher, there's always a question, what do you do with your next book? Most publishers will try to get at least 2 books out of you, maybe 3. And the reason is if you're a new writer, they can get you cheaper that way. And so if your first book hits it really, really big, then they don't have to fork out the really big advance. That's the cynical approach. The other approach is they like to build a working relationship over a period of books. The first right of refusal can get you in trouble if you're not careful. A first right of refusal allows the publisher to be the first one to look at your next book and decide whether or not they want it. There's nothing wrong with that. That's pretty standard in the industry. The only time it's a problem is if there's no period of time tied to it. So, especially in contracts, when you go over contracts, make sure that if the publisher promises to do something, they have a specific amount of time in which to do it. 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, 6 months, whatever it might be. Some people have been caught on this because they haven't checked on it, and they've hooked up with a publisher who is maybe less than honest, are ethical, and they will demand a first right refusal on the next book, and since no time frame is tied to it, they hold on to it for 6 months, a year, 2 years, whatever, and it keeps you from publishing with anyone else. So it's a good thing because the publisher has a right, I think, to want to look at what's next because they're one pouring all the money into your career. However, they need to be able to be held accountable on time. They can't just hold it forever, and some have done that. So you have to be a little cautious with it, expected in most contracts.
Absolutely, yeah. That time frame is very important to watch. You gotta protect yourself. You gotta know what you're signing. So definitely pay attention to that. So awesome. Well, let's dive in today. We're talking craft books, and if you are a longtime listener, you'll know we've covered this topic before. But it's been about a year, possibly more, since we've covered it. Often in our talks, we do touch on particular books that have had some foundational impacts on us. But what I thought we'd do today is a little bit different, and I wanted to start off real quick with a quick discussion of the elements of what makes a good craft book. So I've got my own ideas, but I'm also interested in what you guys think, Pops and Bethany. When you are reading a craft book, we'll start with you, Bethany. What's one of the qualities that makes a craft book just really good for you?
I don't want it to sound like a textbook. I want it to spur me on and give me ideas and simultaneously entertain me, if possible.
Absolutely. Entertaining and encouraging, right? Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Pops?
Well, one of the things I look for is that it's written by a writer. You'd be surprised how many of the craft books are written by someone who doesn't have a career in writing. Maybe they got published with a small press or something like that, and their next work, sometimes because they can't place a second work, is to write a craft book. So the best ones that I have seen have been those that have been in the business for a while, usually as writers. There's been a few that started off as writers that went on to be agents, and so they work in that field. I'm thinking of Zinsser. I'm looking over at my bookcase here, but Zinsser and some of the others, Stein on writing and the like. Some of them go into agenting, or they go to some other area of publishing with it. So look for somebody who has experience and hasn't done just one book. So usually one of the first things I do, if I don't recognize a name, I see what they've published.
Yeah, checking their resume, so to speak. Absolutely. They've got to have the credibility, for sure. For me, what I like is I want a book that's going to have, all of the elements of craft. It would be you'd be hard-pressed to write a book that has all of the elements of fiction, but at least the big major hitters. I want to see something about character. I want to see something about conflict. I want to see something about setting. I want to see something about plot. I want to see something about maybe beginnings and endings. These are all important things that you'd be surprised several craft books don't cover all of these. This is not to say that craft books that focus on a single aspect, say plot and structure, are bad. It's just that the ones that give kind of a complete view I find a little more satisfying because I can come back and just find the proper chapter. They're easy reference guides to come back to. So that's something else that I look for as well.
Yeah, I think that's a good thing, that especially if it's a general book about how to write fiction, and you want to see all those key elements in there. And there are many good books out there that do that. And it's good to read more than one book because you don't want to get an overly focused view. You want a little broader horizon on which to make some of your decisions, because they don't always agree. They'll agree on the key issues, but just like grammar and usage books, they will. There'll be arguments between them. In grammar, there's always a big argument about whether or not further and farther can be used interchangeably as far as distance goes. Technically, it can, but there's so many people that get a little testy about it that it's better not to mix them up. Use farther for distance, further for what's the word I want to use here? Help me out, Bethany. For degree of something, further along in their thinking, farther along the road, so it's a little different. But anyway, there's always going to be little differences and arguments, and depending on which book you read. In craft books, you'll get the same thing, but they will mostly agree. But read more than one.
And how do you guys feel about the craft books that tackle not only how to write, but how to be a writer? And that is to say those that give advice on how to live as a writer, what the writer's life is like, perhaps some business tips and tricks, or I'm thinking specifically here of Bird by Bird by Annie Lamott, which is just
I was thinking of that.
yeah, which is not only how to write but also how to be a writer. And she tackles topics such as what to do when your friends get published before you and you resent them. That wasn't the answer, by the way. That was part of the problem. What happens when you resent your friends for getting published before you? The answer was you still resent them, and then you move on. I'm selling it a little bit short. Obviously, there's a lot more to it than that. But that book is great for encouragement. Do you guys like to see that in your craft books, or does that seem kind of superfluous to you?
I have those books as well, and they're the ones I think that are the ones that are encouraging to me. On Writing by Stephen King is another one, and James Scott Bell's The Art of War for Writers has a lot of those tips and strategies in it, and those are, I think they're really helpful because they give you a realistic perspective on it. There are no easy answers. You're not going to write a book and suddenly Oprah's going to call you and say, let's put this on my show because I believe in it. That doesn't happen. So learning how to be a writer and just keep going and keep going and keep going, perfecting your craft and growing and everything and working on building relationships and networking and how to do all those things well, I think are important. And I was intrigued by you saying you like a well-rounded book that has everything in it because I think I prefer books that specialize in something. I like books about the writing life or books about structure or books about when people choose something that they're passionate about writing well, like Sin and Syntax by Constance Hale, which we'll get to in a little bit, is very much about word choice and grammar and how to make prose musical, and I love that. That's one of my things that I'm passionate about. So I find that really intriguing, and it's a great read, but it's not got anything else about fiction in it. So, but I think those things are important too. I love those kind of books.
Absolutely, and I think it's good to have a variety of those on your shelf, right? You want the ones that specialize, and then you want the ones that are a little more overarching. I think depending on where you are in your writing career, it's also good to consider what types of books are best going to serve you. There are some books that are better for beginning writers, and then there are some books that are way, what I think would be way over the head of a beginning writer. I know because I read them as a beginning writer and they made no sense to me. But now, with a few years under my belt, I'm able to look back and understand what they're saying. So knowing where a book is going to hit you on that spectrum is valuable as well. So Pops, what did you think about the books that include the writer's lifestyle? Do you read those a lot?
I enjoy them because there's sort of a connection then with the author. It's not just craft, but there's the lifestyle that goes with it. Their thinking behind that. So that's what I liked about the Stephen King book on writing. The one that probably touched me the most, that I had the most fun with, is Terry Brooks' Sometimes the Magic Works. Again, that's Terry Brooks. We'll talk about him a little bit later. Sometimes the Magic Works, and he describes walking along, I think it was a beach or something, with his wife, and his very romantic setting, and then his wife said, "You're not here, are you?" And he said, "What?" And it's because he was thinking about his book. Thinking about the next plot point in his book, and he just drifted off, and that's pretty much the way writers are. We live in multiple worlds, and I thought, how refreshing to find somebody who just admits that. Says, no, we're not like everyone else. Our minds wander a lot, and it's just part of the craft.
It gives license to doing that as well. That's one of the things I like about Annie Lamott's Bird by Bird, is that it gives license to feel how you feel as a writer. It gives it affirms your right to feel frustrated when you are suffering from writer's block, etc., so that you don't feel isolated or alone. Writing can be a very lonely sport. So having some books that will admit what it's like to be a writer, I think does make it a lot more, increases the readability, makes it more entertaining, increases the bond between the writer and the reader, and it can have that kind of powerful impact that we're looking for. I also look for a book that's going to have some good examples of what they're trying to show. This might be small examples that the authors have done off the top of their head, or maybe longer passages from well-known works. I think it's really good to be able to pull from a wide variety of source material to show, to demonstrate how other authors are using these particular techniques. I think that's really interesting when they do that. I'm thinking of Ayn Rand's book, which I believe is called On Writing, which I did not enjoy, and it was because she had, I think, in my humble estimation, too high an opinion of herself and her writing. And this is not to say that she's a terrible writer, but virtually every example started with, here's how to do it improperly. This is a bad example. F. Scott Fitzgerald. What? Ernest Hemingway is terrible at this. And then she starts throwing all these well-respected authors under the bus, and then she's like, here's how to do it properly. An example from my book. And all of the positive examples came from her work, and I started thinking, I don't know, it felt a little sketchy to me. So I like a writer who is well-read and can provide examples from a wide spectrum of different literary works. That's something else I look for.
Yeah, examples are extremely important. It's one thing to describe something. This is how you handle dialogue. It is much better to show it being handled. So you can talk about it a little bit and then show it. There's a book, this is on the nonfiction side, that I've always loved. I'm trying to remember it, and it'll come to me in a little bit. I've got too many books over there for this kind of thing. But it showed, I've got a couple of books where they've done this. It shows the manuscript for that book. Took 2 pages out of the manuscript for that book and shows how heavily edited it was in the rewrite. And I thought it was a great way to encourage other writers to know, yes, you're going to rewrite, and here's this guy that has written, 50,000 books, and he's still going through with a heavy hand on the manuscripts and trying to tighten more and make it a little stronger. So I like it when it's not just talked about, but it's shown by example, and that's usually what I spend most of my time on. I'll get the basic point, and then I'll study the example that they give.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's a lot easier to see with the example. So, yes. Anything else, Bethany, that you can think of off the top of your head that a good craft book needs?
Oh, and before you jump in there, Bethany, before you jump in, it's On Writing Well. That's the name of the book I was trying to come up with. I knew it would come up. So I told you I was tired when I started. Yeah. I'm sorry, Bethany.
That's all right. That's all right. With the emphasis on seeing the examples, there are a lot of good examples that come from film as well. So I also like books that will incorporate examples from screenwriting, just because there's all of the skills that are needed for screenwriting, I find, are applicable to fiction writing as well. The tight writing, the subtext, the showing versus telling, making sure that the dialogue is rich but not on the nose, just focusing on the moving the plot forward, those kind of things. So I enjoy books that do that as well. I definitely am a lover of literature, so examples from writing are super important. I'm just adding to what you're saying by saying if there's an example from film that shows something similar, I like that too.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely. So then, with all this in mind, what are the best writing books that we have read, the best books on writing, the best craft books? Now, since I've done this before, I'm going to limit my comments. I'll pop in with a couple of books here and there, but I primarily want to let, Pops, I want to let you kind of handle this, and Bethany, kind of get your perspective, not only as a writer, but also from an editing standpoint, on what you guys feel is the best craft books that you've read. And I thought we'd start off. I invited Tom Morrissey to join us tonight, and he wanted to, but he's having some computer trouble, so we're going to try and have him on. We tried to have him on last week at Blue Ridge, and that didn't work out, sadly, and this week it didn't work either, so hopefully next week. But he's written a great craft book called The Novel and the Novelist, which you've read, Pops, and you had some nice things to say about it.
Yeah, I was given the opportunity to endorse it, and I'm usually pretty particular about that, but in my endorsement of his book, Tom Morrissey's book, The Novel and the Novelist, I said it's not only the best book on writing novels I've read, it's the best written book on writing novels that I've read. He is a superb craftsman. He's got an MFA in creative writing. He's a very, very creative person. He's working with Disney now in Orlando, the Disney company. Very creative writer. I've used some of his work as examples when I've been teaching first pages and the like. It is, I think, a fabulous book. It's from the heart. It's easy to read, but it is written by an experienced writer of well, really various crafts. He was a speechwriter and is again a speechwriter, but he wrote many novels, and they're some of the best novels out there, especially for craft. So it's good not only to read his book, The Novel and the Novelist, but also to read some of his novels to see. And he quotes from his books quite a bit. Sometimes they do that so as not to create copyright problems, but he does that quite a bit, and it's worth it.
You know, on that point, I was reading the first few pages, dedication, introduction to that book. Impressed with it so far. I'm really looking forward to reading the rest. But he makes a point that I agree with. And when writers use examples from their own work, I give you the negative example of Ayn Rand. I think she overdid it, and that she kind of was a little too self-congratulatory. But it's not necessarily what Tom's doing. I don't think. When writers use examples from their own work, oftentimes it's because they're most familiar with it. And so rather than having to read through a variety of different textbooks to find an example, they're, oh, I know I did this in this book. It's a lot easier to find, and like you say, it presents less copyright issues as well. So I don't want to sound like I'm throwing other people under the bus saying, oh, you didn't use examples from Ernest Hemingway. How dare you? That was not my goal at all. But to have somebody who's literate enough to be able to provide examples from a wide variety of places. And Tom does that as well in his book. He's not only quoting from his books, he pulls examples from other places as well. So one of the books that I'm a big fan of that I think I've talked about several times is Mystery and Manners by Flannery O'Connor. And this is actually a little bit different because it's a collection of essays and speeches that she gave on the issues of writing that cover a variety of topics you don't normally see in your typical craft book. This is not simply setting and character and plot, etc. This is really about deeply imagining your characters. This is about how to end your books. This is about, she talks about the moment of grace. She talks about the impossibility of fiction, the unexpected but inevitable ending. These are all things that you don't normally see covered in craft books, and yet she handles them so well and so eloquently. And she does provide examples from her own work, mainly because she says, this is what I'm doing here, and this is how I achieved it in this particular story. But she also says, these ideas are not original to me. I've heard them from these other places. And so she's got some fantastic ideas on writing that I've not heard a lot of people say. I would say this is probably one of the most formative craft books that I've ever read. Its impact stays with me. I consistently go back to the book. I've done blog posts and articles about her ideas, and have just really been inspired by it. And I find myself asking the questions: is my ending unexpected and inevitable? Is my fiction impossible in the way that she describes the impossibility? So those are some of the questions that stay with me, and that's one of the things I really like about that particular book. Bethany, you've got The Sin and Syntax. You mentioned that earlier.
Yes, How to Craft Wicked Good Prose. It's by Constance Hale, who is a journalist, and her writing is tight. And she also does a blog called Sin and Syntax, and I love the way this book is set up. It's about parts of speech. In the beginning, she breaks it down into words, sentences, and then music. And as she looks at the words, she focuses on the parts of speech for a while. But the point of the book is knowing the rules well enough to break them. She says your writing should not only jump off the page, it should strut across the room. And going along with the theme of sin and syntax, she starts with just basic information on the parts of speech, which she calls the bones, and then there's the flesh, which puts a little meat on it and gets more specific, and then she talks about cardinal sins, things that you do not do in your writing when you're using parts of speech. Then she addresses carnal pleasures, which is how you play with the words and have fun with it and build on it. And then there's the catechism, where she uses examples from both film and from prose, and it's great. And then she talks about how with sentences in that part of the book, just what basic sentence structure is, again, bones and flesh, and building on to that. But she talks about the sentence structure and the length and the tone and how that can affect the pacing of your book, and then that moves into music, where she covers melody, rhythm, lyricism, and voice. And it's just it's beautifully written. It's also funny. So I found it a very entertaining book on grammar, and it sharpened my writing and helped me to pay more attention to the music and the writing. It's a great book.
I am a little bit in love with the idea of that book, and I'm going to have to order that from Amazon like tonight. That sounds like it's right up my alley. That's stuff I try and do in my writing, but it'd be great to have a book that is able to give me some solid examples and demonstrate it. And I love that she's extending the metaphor. I've often used a metaphor of the bones and then the flesh, but I like how she extends that and makes it almost religious, sin and syntax, and the cardinal sins and all that. That sounds fantastic and fun. So thank you for that. Yeah. Pops, you've got How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, Orson Scott Card?
Yeah, first I'm going to mention one that I didn't get on the list, and I also noticed that Tess DeGroot had mentioned it also, and that's Ray Bradbury's Zen and the Art of Writing. This goes back to talking about the writer's life. He talks about feeding the muse and the like. Zen and the Art of Writing, very good book. I may leave that out. I think I may need to read it again. With that, Orson Scott Card came out with a book some time ago. It's a Writer's Digest book. Those of you not familiar with Orson Scott Card, he writes science fiction, and he writes it very, very well. He's just a fabulous writer. I remember some of the short stories in the pulp short story magazines that he had been published in before hitting it really big. He's just tremendous in that. But How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, if that is your bailiwick, this is a great book to get. He talks about world creation and what the difference is between fantasy and science fiction. Bookstores don't seem to understand the difference, but trust me, science fiction fans and fantasy fans know the difference. But he talks about that and how to set up worlds and many, many other things. He's a quality writer. How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy, Orson Scott Card.
Best known for his work, Ender's Game. There was that movie that came out based on the book, but his series about Ender Wiggins, and subsequently Bean was another character from that series. He's written several books on them, widely popular among science fiction fans, but also enjoys a good literary reputation. I enjoy his works because he's one of those examples that demonstrates that you can be a quality writer and still write genre. A lot of times people get it in their minds that, oh, just because it's a romance, it's not going to be any good, or just because it's science fiction, it's not going to be any good. That's not necessarily the case. You can have very literary science fiction writers, very literary fantasy writers, very literary romance writers. It happens all the time, and Orson Scott Card is a fantastic example of that. I enjoy his writing as well. I like to say, and we could probably discuss this on another podcast, but I like to say the difference between fantasy and science fiction is that in science fiction, the magic wand has batteries. That's kind of how I explain it. So I think it's fair. Another book that I enjoyed reading is Burning Down the House, and I'm noticing kind of a theme with some of the books that I've chosen to highlight this week, and that is that they're collections of essays and shorter works, not necessarily written with one cohesive whole in mind, but Charles Baxter would sit down and he'd write an essay about the craft of writing fiction for several different outlets, and then collected them into a book called Burning Down the House. If you've listened much to this podcast, you'll know the term stillness that I use a lot, and I reference Charles Baxter. It comes from this particular book, Burning Down the House. Now, it is pretty political. He's got some political views. He's not afraid to mention them, so they're in there. But he even ties that into writing. His whole first chapter is about the evils of the passive voice and why it's evil because politicians use it. And they say things like, mistakes were made. Well, we use passive voice because now there's no subject, so it doesn't say who made the mistakes. It's just they were made. It just happened magically. And it's a way of shifting blame and avoiding blame. So he talks about something as simple which sounds as simple as passive voice, but it's really not a simple thing, and it's a culturally complex issue that he tackles, and by looking at how fiction writers use it and how politicians use it, it reveals something about our character as human beings, especially as Americans, etc. And I think he's got some really interesting things to say in there that have stayed with me, if I could speak. And that's a book that I will often go back to. But again, The Stillness, if you haven't had an opportunity to read that particular essay, it's really good, and I suggest picking that up as well. Bethany, The Art of War for Writers.
Yes, this is James Scott Bell, and he says that he likes it to, he wants to fill in the cracks between what other craft books are missing. There are 3 main sections in the book: reconnaissance, tactics, and strategy. And reconnaissance is kind of the mental game, the mental discipline, the preparing yourself in your mind and being up to the challenge, thinking through everything that you're going to do, writing it well. Those days when you don't feel like you're writing, when it feels too much like a battlefield, when you are resentful and you're comparing yourself to others, those kind of things. The tactics is a section about craft, and all of these pieces are short. I guess it's sort of a collection of essays. It is much based on Sun Tzu, who was a Chinese general who wrote about the art of war, and so it's short, and they're succinct, and they're packed with strategy and really encouraging and challenging. And then the last piece, the strategy, is about the publishing biz, just the biz side of things, how you've got to be consistent, you've got to be patient, you've got to, it talks about the importance of networking, the importance of quality. Good enough is not good enough anymore, that you have to really stand out from the rest, and what you may need to do that. So it's practical. It's something that I go back to again and again for short little snippets that I need from time to time. It's a great one.
And you said it was Sun Tzu who wrote The Art of War originally?
Yes.
Is that, okay. And it's interesting that you bring that up, because one of the ones that I put on here, and this is probably be the last one that I share, but it's The War of Art, and so it's a twist on The Art of War, and it's an interesting book. It's by Stephen Pressfield. It doesn't deal so much with craft as it deals with creativity, and I enjoy reading books about creativity. I absolutely love that, and I think that we should be reading books on creativity in the same way that we should be reading books on craft, because as fiction writers, that's what we do. We create and we imagine. And he sets down some guidelines of how to approach your artistry, be it writing or painting or sculpting or whatever it is. But he talks about it, kind of attacking it with this attitude of almost a warlike attitude, that you must be diligent and vigilant. You must be proactive. You must have a strategy in mind. And so he goes through all these steps on how to handle your creativity in a more proactive way, rather than what we often see, which are writers who say things like, I write when I'm inspired, which generally means you don't write much, if at all. And so he kind of takes that to task a little bit, and it's an interesting read. I haven't read it in several years, but it is kind of an interesting book. So it's a fun read, if nothing else. So now, Pops, you've also mentioned earlier that you mentioned Terry Brooks' book, Sometimes the Magic Works.
Yeah, I think it's one of the best I've read. I was just looking at all the stuff I underlined and notes I made in it. Some good stuff. He starts with just a little quote. He says, "This is for writers yet to be published who think the uphill climb will never end. Keep believing. This is also for published writers grown jaded by the process. Remember how lucky you are." And he has a bunch of those throughout the book. Before each chapter, he has those little sayings which really stuck with me. He wrote, "The muse whispers to you when she chooses, and you can't tell her to come back later because you quickly learn in this business that she might not come back at all." But then he goes into "I'm Not All Here" and "Where Do You Get Your Ideas" and "Tough Love," and it's really just an excellent book. Terry Brooks, for those not familiar, is a fantasy writer. He was an attorney turned fantasy writer, and he tells the story of his first few book signings and stuff like that. That nobody was coming for his books, but they would be taking all the books for the guy next to him. It's just great all the way around, and I highly recommend it. It might be a little difficult to get now. It was published by Del Rey. It's a Ballantine book. Del Rey was one of the early science fiction editors. He was a writer, gained more fame really by being an editor of science fiction, and then they gave him an imprint. So, great book.
Absolutely. Yeah, I remember reading that on your recommendation. I still remember one of the stories. It's very anecdotal in a lot of ways. Anecdotal in a lot of ways. And one of the stories I remember is when he was playing with his, I believe it was his grandson, and his grandson had a little lion figurine that he was flying all over the place, and he kept saying, "Lions don't fly, lions don't fly." And the little boy said, "But why not?" And that got him thinking, why not? Why can't lions fly? And so the principle there is not telling yourself no, and that I think is very powerful. Going back to that idea of creativity, how to harness your creativity, how to utilize it, how to feed the muse, or to at least be conscious of it. So a lot of really good stuff in that book as well. And now I feel bad because I've read several of the books that you've recommended, Pops, but Bethany, I've not had a chance to read some of these books, and they look outstanding to me. And I'm excited for this podcast because now I've got a great list of books that I don't know if my wife will be excited when she sees my Amazon bill come through, but I will be excited. So, Bethany, you have here Dr. Linda Seeger's Writing Subtext, What Lies Beneath?
Yes, this is one that I have not read yet. I just picked it up at Blue Ridge, and I am really excited about it. It's about subtext, which I just want to read the opening paragraph because it applies to prose. She's an expert consultant for screenwriting, but again, I was saying that affects how we write prose well, too. She says, in drama, more than any other art form, people don't say what they mean. It isn't always a lie. It isn't always fudging or denying the truth. Sometimes characters think they're telling the truth. Sometimes they don't know the truth. Sometimes they don't feel comfortable expressing the truth. In great drama, there are the words themselves and the truth beneath the words. That is text and subtext. They're not the same, and they're not supposed to be. And the book breaks it down into character and backstory, the words used in dialogue, the gestures, what's happening in the scene, and how you can use those things. One of the examples in the book, just skimming through, is someone who is asked by a coworker how they're doing, and they say, "I'm fine, thank you." But they're packing up their belongings, they've just been fired, and they're getting ready to leave. So showing those things rather than giving an on-the-nose answer, and by on-the-nose I mean that writing that just explains, "I just got fired, I don't feel great, thanks for asking." That's not the kind of dialogue that people want to read. They'd rather see the subtext. They'd rather enjoy a book where they're peeling back the layers and getting to know the characters like that. So I'm really excited about reading this one.
Absolutely. Sounds like a lot of fun. You've also mentioned here and story stump structure. Or
Back up and try that again. Back up and try that again.
Well, I mean, it stumps structure. I don't know exactly what structure is, other than it's stumped right now by story, which is written by Jeevan Stames. I'm going too far right now. I don't sleep these days. So Stephen James' book, Story Trumps Structure. If I could get that right, is this? I believe this is another Writer's Digest book. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
Okay, and I think we've talked about it before, Pops. I know that Stephen James' personal opinion on the 3-act structure, etc. But this is really a book, and Bethany, I'll let you talk a little bit more about it, about discovery writing, or what he calls organic writing, and the process that you should go through in order to make sure that it comes out right. So I'm sure you can say it much more eloquently than can I.
I don't know, but I will say it's about liberating your writing. There are so many books that have to do with the formula and the structure, and those work wonderfully for people who are outliners and plotters. For people who are more organic, there's a tendency to write yourself into a corner, and it can get very difficult to keep going. And this is a book that gives you some tools, some ways to see the writing and what you're doing with the characters to liberate them and keep the story going. Stephen James, if you've read his work, is definitely not a 3-act person. There's act after act. They just keep going, but they're fascinating. And he's, in my opinion, one of the kings of subtext, which is why I enjoy reading his books so much. Rarely do his characters say what they're thinking, and that's fascinating to read. But this book is about conflict. It's about tension and desire, building to a crisis, having a moment of decision and a struggle and a discovery, and then moving on to the next. So he just kind of breaks it down into those 6 things: tension, desire, crisis, escalation, struggle, and discovery. And it's just kind of a wheel that just keeps rolling through the story and building and building and building.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the last one that we have here is often also recommended by you, Bethany.
Don't call me Betty.
I've been up since 3:30 this morning, so I apologize. So yeah, long week. So you mentioned the Emotion Thesaurus by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. Did I get that right?
Puglisi. Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yes.
Excellent.
This is one of the ones that I recommend most highly to my clients. So often, there's, especially with beginning writers, there's a tendency to just explain. She was feeling angry. She was feeling abandoned. This book it's a thesaurus. So you look up the emotion that you want to express, and there is a definition for that emotion. Then there are 20 to 30 physical signals. There are internal sensations, mental responses, cues of long-term anguish if it's something that they really continue to struggle with, and cues of suppressed anguish. It even will talk about it may escalate to, for example, anguish may escalate to desperation or to depression, and then there are page numbers for those. You can go look up those emotions to get some more physical cues and internal sensations, so that as you're writing in third-person deep or close point of view, you really can express and you can show what the characters are feeling as opposed to just stating it. That's one of the things that I'm most often having to point out in my editing work. And so this book it makes it really easy. It's a resource that is just a great tool. I think it's something that I definitely use in my writing, but the more familiar I get with it, the less I need to, because I can imagine and think about what I would do in those circumstances. But on that note, this is one of the things I like about it too. Not everybody who feels that emotion would feel the same internal sensation that I do, or use the same body language that I do when they're feeling it. And not every character should look like me. And so as I'm writing people who are not at all like me, this helps me with that, because I can just see some other options. It helps me to get outside of my box.
Agreed. Sounds like a fantastic resource. I like the way that that's set up. Another good one to have on your shelf to reach for when you're at those pivotal moments in your writing and that pivotal moments of your story. So we've got a full room tonight listening in, and I do want to go through their comments, but before we get to that, Pops, are there any other last-minute books that you wanted to add? There's several that are mentioned here in the chat room that I'd like to get to.
Yeah, Deb Rainey mentions, and hello, Deb Rainey. Deborah Rainey mentions self-editing for fiction writers, which is good, by Brown and King, not Stephen King, different King, but Brown and King, and Stein on Writing, which, as she mentions, is a classic, and writing the breakout novel. I've got all of those on my shelves, so she'd be proud of me.
Yeah, absolutely. Mary Ruth Hughes is watching tonight, as is Molly Jo, and Molly Jo mentions that she really enjoyed Blue Ridge, by the way. Had a great time there. Becky Lindsay also watching, also went to Blue Ridge and had a good time there as well. Edie Melson, we said, is here as well. Let's see. Molly Jo wants to point out, Pops, that if a writer writes a book on writing, that makes them a writer. So,
but it doesn't make them. It doesn't make them a novelist. I'm not opposed to nonfiction writers because I write a lot of nonfiction too, but it doesn't make them an expert in writing novels. So, and my whole point was that they have more than one book under their belt, to have some experience before they start writing on how to do this. Yeah. Just because I fixed carburetor on a car once, carburetor, that probably ages me, but carburetor on an old car once doesn't mean that I'm the mechanic to come to when your car breaks down. In fact, I guarantee it. I'm not the mechanic to come to. So I try to look for experience either from the editing side of things, written by established editors, our agents, and most of those agents will have been writers at some point, and then experienced writers like Ray Bradbury and Terry Brooks and Stephen King and some, Stephen James that we mentioned, James Scott Bell, all of those folks, they're active writers, Tom Morrissey. So that's what I look for, is that kind of credentialing.
Absolutely, yeah. Tess DeGroot mentions On Writing by Stephen King. The reason we didn't mention that here tonight is because we did mention it on our earlier podcast. It's a fantastic book. Hard to say anything bad about it. She also mentions, as you said earlier, Pop, Zen and the Art of Writing by Ray Bradbury. Also, The Writer's Journey by Christopher Vogler also inspires her and helps her out. Molly Jo likes Bird by Bird and Mystery and Manners. I told her to read those, and she did, and so good things happen there. Tess DeGroot agrees with the non-example can be overdone if not done properly. They apparently liked my comment about the magic wand has batteries, so hooray for me. Pat myself on the head there. Tess DeGroot also has some of James Scott Bell's writing, but not the Art of War, or the Art of War for Writers. And let's see, Edie Melson, also a fan of Sometimes the Magic Happens and On Writing by, I think, Stephen King and Bird by Bird. So we do have a long-time viewer, she says, but the first time she's watching live, and that's Jenny Snow, and she makes a good point here. She says, I also feel suspicious of the advice writing speakers give when they make too much of a habit of pointing out how published novels messed up or could have been better. With a little-known author... when a little-known author is downing a... See, I can't even read tonight. Is downing a well-known author, it seems to erode their credibility, and I would completely agree with that. That's the risk you run if you are, let's say insulting somebody like Ayn Rand, and you don't have the sales to back it up. It does erode your credibility because they're obviously established writers, and there's millions of people who will attest to their ability. So maybe I should pull Ayn from under the bus and dust her off a little bit. So she's also not a science fiction writer, but Orson Scott Card's How to Write Science Fiction and Fantasy really helped her out, she said, for beginning writers. You mentioned Deb Rainey and Stein on writing the breakout novel, etc. And I think that's... Oh, Edie liked The Emotion Thesaurus also. Becky has read The Elements of Style, which is always good. And I think H.R. Hook. Oh, hi Heather. Heather's watching. Hello Heather. We saw you up at Blue Ridge, and she also likes Story Trump Structure. Says changed her life forever as a writer, and she's got a great story about that. So it is a very powerful book. Tess DeGroot just ordered Sin and Syntax and The Art of War for Writers. So Bethany, I think you get a commission on that.
Cool.
And oh my goodness, so many questions. There's like 14 more that came in. Heather wants to know, and I'm going to throw this one to you, Pops. She wants to know what the difference is between a writer and an author.
Yeah, probably if we're going to be real strict about it, a writer can be anybody who writes anything. The back of cereal boxes, greeting cards, journalism, nonfiction, biographies. Usually author is used for book writers of some sort. Now, that's a bit of a stretch, and you probably find somebody disagree with it. I don't think we need to be that dogmatic about it, but most would say When they say I'm an author, what they're trying to say is I write books. They say I'm a writer. It could be anything, because there are so many different types of writers. So one's more refined, or I shouldn't say refined. One's a broader term. Writer's a broader term. Author is probably a little more specific, a little more narrow. But even then, you could probably make the case that there isn't that much of a difference.
Yeah.
Then I have a story about Stephen James with the story Trump Structure. A few years ago, we had, and those of you listening online may not know much about the Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference, but it's a big conference that Edie Nelson and I lead out in North Carolina, and we have a habit of some of the faculty sneaking off to a very special pizza joint, and he got in an argument with another writer. It wasn't, a tough argument, but boy, they were debating hotly their differences in view. The other writer was a 3-act structure person, and the truth is they probably agreed on the essence of it, that structure is good, but the thing that really matters is getting a great story, and that would trump structure in some cases. But anyway, it was kind of fun watching them, and it was Stephen James against this woman. I was pretty sure the woman was going to take him right there, just beat him, but she didn't. She showed mercy and grace, and I didn't, knock him to the floor or anything that I saw. I don't know what happened in the parking lot after that, but.
There are a few things that are better than watching two very well-educated and very intelligent people on different sides of a divisive issue, explaining their points and backing it up. It's quite fun, and some of us just kind of sat back and watched and enjoyed the show. I don't know if we're those kids that are in the high school yelling "fight, fight, fight," but it was cool. It was cool. Intellectual debate. Deb Rainey has jumped in. She's shared a few more here. She says Jeff Gerke's plot versus character. Jeff Gerke's been out to Blue Ridge a few times as well, and she likes anything by James Scott Bell, especially plot and structure. So some quality books there. And again, if you are thirsty for some more recommendations of good books, I'd encourage you to look back through our archives on aarongansky.com. Just check out the blog there, and you'll have to scroll back. Maybe what I'll do is I'll try and put it in the show notes for this week's show notes, which will go up Monday morning, early Monday morning. So you can check there. That'll make it a lot easier for you. Give you a few more books to buy and have on your shelf. So before we sign off, any last words from Bethany or from you, Pops?
If you're interested in the novel and the novelist by Tom Morrissey, I interviewed him some time ago when the book first came out. So probably the best place to go, I don't know if I have it on my website, but go to YouTube/Alton Gansky, youtube.com/Alton Gansky, and start looking for the Tom Morrissey. Had I had more time today, I would have got the date for it. But if you want to see that, we talk about the release of his book. So if you have an interest in that, you can do that, or Aaron, you can post it on your site if you want, and get the embed code and post it on your site. That might be good.
Yeah, absolutely. I'll try and do that in the show notes. I'll leave myself a note here real quick. Otherwise, I will forget. And Bethany, you have anything else?
The Emotion Thesaurus, Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi, they have a great website called Writers Helping Writers, and this is actually part of a series. They also have a positive trait thesaurus and a negative trait thesaurus when you have characters who are not well-rounded enough just to brainstorm. They're great, and they're working on a skills thesaurus. So if they're just picking skills like surfing or refinishing furniture and just talking about the kind of what goes into that, and just to put resources in the hands of people. But it's a great website that has a real strong community, lots of people helping one another, and a lot of great resources there. So I just wanted to recommend that.
All right, thank you. And I'm actually going to toss it right back to you and ask how people can get in touch with you if they're interested in your editing services or in what you're currently writing, etc.
All right. They can touch base with me at alittleredink.com. They can spell it with a K or a C. It was a C for a little while until we found out that we had to be legit to use the incorporated thing, so we edited it and made it a little K. And so now it's alittleredink.com. We edit fiction, and I'm writing contemporary fiction
Excellent. And
for
when
20
you
to
say
30 something. So.
and you say we, you and your sister, correct?
Oh yes, yeah. How about that?
So
Yeah, my sister Erin Newman is also an editor, and they can contact either one of us through that blog.
excellent, awesome. And Pops, how do they get in touch with you?
Well, the altongansky.com is still the best place, and you can link from that to just about everything else. And we'll be getting underway pretty soon on Blue Ridge 2016 for next May. So you can go to the brmcwc.com. It's just the initials, Blue Ridge Mountain Christian Writers Conference .com if you want to learn a little bit more about it.
Absolutely, and start saving your pennies now. It is well worth the time and the money. It's a great experience. As always, you guys can get in touch with me through aarongansky.com. You can find me on the Facebook and on the Tweeters at 80Gansky for the Twitter, and Facebook's just 80Gansky as well. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on iTunes. If you want to download any of the previous podcasts that way, you can do that there as well. So we thank you all for listening, and until next week, good writing.